The air at the bottom of the Coalition proving grounds didn't taste like victory or honor. It tasted like hot copper, wet ash, and decades of rot. Cadet Dean lay cheek-first in the damp grit, listening to his own shallow breathing and the sickening, rhythmic pop of his dislocated left shoulder. Above him, 30 feet in the dark, the rusted iron grate slammed shut with a heavy, metallic clang that vibrated deep in his teeth. Clang. The sound was absolute. It was the final, unyielding exclamation point at the end of a 6-month nightmare. Failure is a biological contaminant, Cadet Dean, a voice echoed through the PA system, filtered through the cold, electronic monotone of his ear implant matrix. The voice belonged to Instructor Caldwell, a tall, chitin-armored alien whose natural speech sounded like grinding river stones. Caldwell didn't care for humans. To the Coalition, Earth was nothing more than a soft, fleshy joke, a backwater death world that produced slow, fragile bipeds who broke under high-gravity drills. The Coalition does not waste energy shipping defective cargo back to primitive homeworlds, Caldwell's translated voice rasped down into the gloom. We recycle. Consider your remaining caloric value an offering to the Vanguard Hounds. May your end serve the war effort. The heavy floodlights flickered, shifting from harsh white to a bruised, pulsing emergency purple. The feeding cycle had begun. Dean squeezed his eyes shut. A sharp, white-hot spike of agony shot down his left arm every time he tried to shift his weight. He didn't feel a sudden surge of righteous anger. He didn't feel the Hollywood hero urge to roar at the ceiling or claw his way up 30 feet of slippery concrete. He was just so damn tired. For half a year, he had endured gravity that felt like carrying a mid-sized sedan on his spine. He had choked down synthetic protein paste that tasted like melted plastic and chalk. He had marched until the soles of his boots wore down to the leather, and then marched until his socks turned crimson. All for what? To misjudge a jump across a plasma trench by a measly 3 inches, snap a ligament, and get tossed into a trash chute? He dragged himself backward, his boots scraping through wet sludge, until his spine hit the damp, curved stone of the enclosure wall. Right, Dean muttered into the darkness, his voice raspy and thin. Dinner time. Out of sheer habit, his right hand patted his torn fatigue jacket. No sidearm. No tactical blade. Not even a flare. All he had was a crushed, cracked glow stick that barely emitted a sickly green halo, and a single, battered foil packet of synthetic peanut butter ration he'd swiped from the mess hall hours ago. Across the cavernous pit, a massive hydraulic gate groaned. The sound of rusted gears grinding together cut through the silence, followed by the heavy, hollow thud of a steel blast door sliding up its track. They were in. Dean leaned his head back against the freezing rock. He didn't bother trying to stand. The Vanguard Hounds weren't just animals, they were the Coalition's premier terror weapon. Selective breeding mixed with brutal genetic splicing had created 6-legged apex predators designed specifically to break planetary sieges. A fully equipped squad of hardened infantry usually took heavy casualties trying to bring down just one. Dean had a broken shoulder, a bruised rib, and a pocket full of fake peanut butter. A low, subterranean rumble rolled through the floorboards. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, it was a frequency you felt in your jawbone. Then came the sounds. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. Heavy, razor-sharp claws tapping against the stone. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. In this pit, the meat had nowhere to run. I should be screaming, Dean thought. I should be praying. Instead, his mind flashed back to a freezing gas station outside Omaha, Nebraska, 3 years ago. Working the 3 a.m. shift under flickering fluorescent lights, watching half-starved stray dogs pick through the dumpster behind the mechanic's shop. He remembered how those dogs looked at him, eyes wide, muscles tense, waiting for a rock or a kick. He remembered tossing them expired hot dogs just to watch the tension leave their starving frames. The smell hit him next. A hot, humid wave of ozone, feral musk, and raw copper. From the ink-black shadows across the pit, a silhouette detached itself. It was massive, the size of a heavy utility vehicle, hunched low with rolling, fluid muscle. Jagged plates of thick, chitinous armor ran down its spine, catching the dim purple light like polished obsidian. Dean didn't flinch. He just stared into the gloom. "Come on then," Dean whispered, holding his uninjured arm tight across his chest. "Let's get this over with." The beast stepped fully out of the shadows, and even in his exhausted resignation, Dean's breath hitched. Calling it a hound was an insult to dogs everywhere. It possessed 4 thick, heavily muscled hind legs built for terrifying leaps, and 2 smaller, articulated forelimbs tucked near its chest, ending in scythe-like claws. Its head was a wedge of thick, scarred bone plating, completely devoid of eyes. Instead, a crown of fleshy, twitching sensory pits lined its skull, flaring and contracting with every ragged breath. Its jaw was a terrifying maze of overlapping, serrated mandibles that clicked together like sharpening knives. Behind it, 2 more shadows emerged. Slightly smaller, but no less lethal. A pack. The lead hound lowered its massive wedge-shaped head. The sensory pits along its skull flared wide, drinking in the scent of human fear, sweat, and blood. It let out a huff of air that ruffled Dean's hair, a breath that reeked of sulfur and old carnage. Click. Clack. The lead beast took a slow, deliberate step forward. The lead hound, a massive, terrifying wall of muscle and obsidian chitin, stopped less than 3 feet from Dean's boots. Up close, the creature wasn't just a terrifying biological weapon, it was a ruin of battle scars. The thick, grayish hide between its armor plates was crisscrossed with jagged plasma burns and deep, unhealed gouges. Its smaller left forelimb hung at an awkward angle, the joint swollen and weeping a clear, viscous fluid. Dean frowned, his eyes tracking from the swollen joint up to the creature's massive flank. Beneath the terrifying exterior, Dean recognized something deeply familiar in the way the beast held itself. It wasn't the proud, confident stance of an apex predator on the hunt. Its shoulders were hunched too tightly, its weight distributed unevenly to favor its injured leg. It was the posture of a beaten dog. An animal that expected pain. Behind the leader, the 2 smaller hounds hovered in the shadows, their mandibles clicking in rapid, agitated bursts. They wanted to tear into the soft biped, but they wouldn't move until the alpha gave the signal. The lead hound, whom Dean immediately dubbed Duke for his sheer, imposing bulk, leaned in closer. The sensory pits along its skull rippled, hovering mere inches from Dean's face. The intense heat radiating off the beast's body washed over him, carrying the sharp scent of raw ozone. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Dean moved his uninjured right hand. The 2 smaller hounds hissed violently, their back legs coiling tight to spring. Duke let out a low warning rumble, a bass vibration that rattled Dean's teeth, but the alpha didn't lunge. Its eyeless head followed the slow, deliberate trajectory of Dean's hand as it reached into his torn jacket pocket. Dean's fingers brushed the crinkled foil of his synthetic peanut butter ration. He pulled it out slowly. Duke flinched. It was a minuscule jerk of the massive head, but Dean caught it. The beast thought he was drawing a weapon, a shock baton or a stun prod. "Easy, big guy," Dean whispered, his voice paper-thin in the cavernous pit. "Nobody's getting shocked today. Just take it easy." Keeping his movements exaggeratedly calm, Dean bit the top of the foil wrapper and tore it open. The sharp, artificial aroma of roasted peanuts and caramelized sugar exploded into the stagnant air, instantly slicing through the thick stench of rust and sulfur. The frantic clicking of mandibles stopped instantly. All 3 hounds froze. Their sensory pits flared wide, aiming like laser sights directly at the tiny brown brick of paste in Dean's hand. "They're starving," Dean realized with sudden, crystal clarity. The coalition didn't feed these beasts before dropping condemned cadets into the pit. They kept them perpetually starved. They kept them mean. Dean snapped the dense protein bar in half. Pain flared through his dislocated left shoulder, but he ignored it, tossing one half onto the damp stone right between Duke's massive front paws. The chunk of ration hit the floor with a soft thud. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The alpha hound stared down at the brown brick. Dean held his breath against the icy stone wall. Then Duke shifted. The massive, wedge-shaped head lowered. The terrifying mandibles parted, revealing rows of curved, razor-sharp teeth. With a surprisingly delicate flick of a thick gray tongue, the beast scooped the ration off the floor and swallowed it whole. Duke raised his head, the sensory pits flaring as they focused on Dean's face, then flicked down to the remaining half of the ration in his right hand. The creature's hunched, aggressive stance had relaxed just a fraction. The bone-rattling growl had completely ceased. Dean let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. A bitter, disbelieving laugh bubbled up in his throat, echoing strangely in the dim purple gloom. He looked up toward the high, iron-grated ceiling, where Instructor Caldwell was undoubtedly watching through a secure feed, waiting for the blood to start pooling. "You cheap bastards," Dean muttered to the ceiling. "You don't even feed your own dogs." He turned his attention back to Duke. The massive alien predator was staring at his hand, looking less like a nightmare of galactic warfare and more like a stray mutt begging for scraps outside an Omaha diner. Dean broke the remaining half into 2 smaller pieces. He tossed one to the left and one to the right. The 2 subordinate hounds snapped the morsels out of the air before they could even touch the ground. Duke let out a short, sharp huff. It wasn't a roar, it was a demand. The alpha stepped closer, lowering its massive head until it was level with Dean's chest. The beast didn't open its jaws. Instead, it pressed its heavy, scarred snout firmly against Dean's uninjured shoulder, nearly knocking the human over with the sheer force of the nudge. "More," the gesture clearly said. Dean rested his head back against the freezing wall and let out a genuine, exhausted smile. "Sorry, Duke," he said, holding up his empty, grease-stained hands. "That's all I've got. You'll have to eat me if you're still hungry." Duke snorted, a blast of hot, sulfur-scented air washing over Dean's face. The beast turned in a tight circle, its heavy claws clicking against the stone floor, and then collapsed heavily right next to the human. The massive, armored bulk of the apex predator pressed warmly against Dean's right side, radiating heat into his freezing, bruised body. Seeing their alpha settle, the 2 smaller hounds, whom Dean dubbed Scrap and Patch, trotted over and dropped onto the stone, forming a loose, protective semicircle around the human. Dean sat in the dim purple light, wedged tightly between a wet concrete wall and 1,000 pounds of lethal alien muscle. He reached out with his good hand and tentatively rested his palm on the thick, rough hide of Duke's shoulder. The beast didn't flinch. It simply let out a long, rumbling sigh and closed its heavy jaws. Up in the observation deck, Instructor Caldwell was going to have a very confusing afternoon. Time lost its meaning in the pit. Without a sun to track or a clock to watch, minutes stretched into an amorphous, purple haze. Dean drifted in and out of a shallow, feverish doze. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm that synchronized perfectly with his heartbeat. The cold dampness of the stone wall seeped through his torn jacket, settling deep into his bones, but his right side felt like it was resting against a furnace. Duke radiated incredible heat. The massive creature's breathing was a slow, mechanical wheeze that gently lifted and dropped its heavily armored ribcage against Dean's side. Every so often, the beast would twitch in its sleep, its heavy, scythe-like forelimbs scraping uselessly against the stone floor, dreaming of whatever nightmares apex predators had. Across the small span of the floor, Scrap and Patch were curled into tight defensive balls. They snored, a wet, clicking sound like a loose fan belt in an old engine. Dean kept his eyes half open, staring up at the grated ceiling. His mouth tasted like pennies and old adrenaline. He felt ridiculously small, but for the first time in 6 months, he also felt completely peaceful. The coalition wanted him dead, the universe didn't care, and the monsters just wanted a nap. A sharp, metallic screech shattered the quiet. Dean flinched, his right hand instinctively curling into a fist. Duke awoke instantly. The beast didn't stretch or yawn, it snapped from deep sleep to total, rigid alertness. The sensory pits along its wedge-shaped skull flared wide and red in the dim light. A low, bone-rattling vibration started deep in its chest. Scrap and Patch were on their feet a second later, their mandibles clacking in rapid, agitated bursts. High above, the heavy iron grating groaned and slid back on its rusted tracks. Brilliant, unfiltered white light poured down like a physical weight. Dean squinted, throwing his good arm over his eyes as his retinas burned. He heard the harsh grinding clicks of Caldwell's native language echoing through the PA system, immediately followed by the flat, raspy translation matrix in his ear. Maintenance crew, deploy the incinerator drones. Clear the organic refuse and prepare the enclosure for, Caldwell's translated voice cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and punctuated only by the low hum of the overhead floodlights. Dean slowly lowered his arm. He couldn't see Caldwell through the glare, but he could feel the static tension radiating from the observation deck above. "I'm not refused yet, Caldwell." Dean called out, his voice hoarse and cracking on the last word. "Though I could use a fresh uniform." A different sound echoed from above, the high-pitched whine of heavy repulsor engines. A square section of the wall adjacent to the pit began to lower, revealing a heavy transport lift descending slowly into the arena. On it stood 4 Coalition security officers. They wore fully sealed, matte black impact armor. In their hands, they held heavy, triple-barreled shock rifles, their coils glowing with a lethal, electric blue charge. Duke stepped forward. The Alpha Hound placed itself directly between Dean and the descending lift. It didn't roar. It dropped its heavy head low to the ground, its powerful hind legs coiling tight. The thick armor plates along its spine lifted, exposing the softer, darker tissue underneath in a classic threat display. Scrap and Patch flanked him, matching the aggressive posture. Cadet Dean, Caldwell's voice crackled over the PA, stripped of its usual mocking tone. "Step away from the Vanguard units." Slowly. Dean looked at the glowing muzzles of the shock rifles. 4 heavily armed guards, twitchy and terrified, facing down 3 hungry, stressed predators. If someone pulled a trigger, this enclosed pit would turn into a meat grinder. The hounds would tear the guards apart, but not before the rifles cooked everyone alive, Dean included. "They're guarding their territory, Caldwell." Dean yelled back, not moving an inch. "You drop 4 guys with charged rifles down here, they're going to defend it. They are feral biological weapons, Cadet. They do not have territory, they have targets. Step away." The lift hit the floor of the arena with a heavy, metallic clang. The guards raised their rifles, the blue hum intensifying until it set Dean's teeth on edge. Duke let out a deafening roar, a sound that defied description, like twisting metal mixed with a screeching train car. The beast lunged forward a single pace, its claws gouging deep trenches into the stone floor. "Hold your fire!" Dean screamed. He didn't think, he just moved. Shoving himself off the wall, vision swimming with gray spots as his shoulder flared, Dean stumbled forward and grabbed a fistful of the thick, coarse hide on the back of Duke's neck. The guards flinched, their fingers tightening on the triggers. "Duke, hey! Stop!" Dean pulled hard on the hide, throwing his meager weight backward. It was like trying to hold back a freight train with a shoelace, but the beast froze. Duke snapped its massive head around, mandibles clicking aggressively, sensory pits flaring wildly as they took in Dean. Hot gusts of sulfur-scented air washed over Dean's face. Dean didn't let go. He kept his grip tight, ignoring the screaming pain in his left arm, and forced himself to exhale a long, slow breath. "Easy," Dean muttered, keeping his voice low and steady, just like he had with the peanut butter ration. He patted the thick, scarred armor plating. "Easy, big guy. Just stand down. They aren't worth it." Duke rumbled, a deep, agitated sound, but the Alpha didn't lunge again. It shifted its weight backward, breaking its aggressive stance, though it kept its eyeless face trained dead on the security team. Seeing their Alpha relent, Scrap and Patch stopped clicking and backed up, their bodies still tense. Dean looked past the massive alien shoulder at the guards. They were frozen in place, their shock rifles trembling slightly. "Lower the damn guns," Dean gasped, his legs suddenly feeling like wet paper. "Unless you want to clean up the mess." Up in the observation deck, Caldwell remained completely silent. Dean leaned heavily against Duke's flank, his good hand still tangled in the coarse hide, and waited to see if the coalition was stupid enough to open fire. The medbay smelled of bleach and crushed mint, a harsh, synthetic cocktail that burned the inside of Dean's nostrils. It was blindingly bright. Overhead surgical lights cast a sterile, shadowless glare that made his eyes water every time he tried to keep them open for more than a few seconds. He sat on a cold, stainless steel examination table, his torn fatigue jacket long gone, replaced by a thin, paper-like hospital gown that offered zero warmth. "Brace," a medical droid chirped in a pleasant, synthetic soprano. Before Dean could tighten his grip on the table, the droid's cold mechanical manipulators clamped down on his left shoulder. Pop. A white-hot flash of agony arched up his neck and shot straight down into his fingertips. Dean choked on a scream, his vision blacking out for a split second. He slumped forward, gasping for air as cold sweat instantly beaded on his forehead. Ligament realigned. Microfractures sealed. Applying dermal patch, the droid announced cheerfully. A numbing gel slapped over his bruised skin, followed by a tight, rigid compression bandage that locked his shoulder against his ribs. "Thanks," Dean wheezed, spitting the metallic taste of pain out of his mouth. "Your bedside manner is incredible." The heavy sliding doors of the medbay hissed open. Instructor Caldwell stepped inside, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the pristine, brightly lit room. Without the dim shadows of the proving grounds, Caldwell's features were fully exposed, pale, segmented skin stretched tight over a rigid exoskeleton. With multiple compound eyes clicking independently. Behind Caldwell stepped a human. Dean blinked away his remaining tears of pain. The man wore the crisp, dark gray uniform of Coalition intelligence, no rank insignia, no name tag, just a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it cost more than Dean's entire hometown. His hair was heavily salted with gray, cut with military precision, and his eyes were the flat, unreadable color of wet slate. "Cadet Dean," the man said. His voice was quiet, lacking the booming authority typical of the brass. It was the voice of a man who never had to repeat himself. "I am Director Miller. You've had a highly irregular morning." Dean carefully sat up straight, his left arm immobilized against his chest. "Yes, sir. Usually I just get yelled at before lunch. Today was a nice change of pace." Caldwell's mandibles clicked rapidly in irritation, a sound the translation matrix helpfully filtered out. Director Miller didn't smile, though a faint crease appeared at the corner of his eye. "Instructor Caldwell informs me that you failed the plasma trench jump," Miller said, clasping his hands behind his back. "And per protocol for terminal failures, you were deposited into the Vanguard enclosure." "I was thrown into a pit of starving monsters," Dean corrected, his voice flat. He was far too tired for military decorum. "Is there a form I need to sign to get my boots back, or am I headed to the brig for surviving?" Miller walked slowly toward the examination table. He looked Dean up and down, his gaze lingering on the heavy medical bracing on Dean's shoulder. "The Vanguard Hounds are an engineered species, Dean," Miller said, his tone almost conversational. "Bred from the apex predators of the Calera system. They are incredibly resilient, brutally efficient, and notoriously unstable. We lose an average of a dozen handlers a year just trying to move them between transport shuttles. They do not bond. They do not socialize. They kill, and they eat. Miller stopped at the foot of the table. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a flat data pad, and held it up. It was security footage from the pit. Dean watched the grainy, purple-tinted video of himself, looking tiny and battered, breaking a peanut butter ration in half and tossing it to the massive, heavily armored Alpha. He watched the beast swallow it, step forward, and gently press its scarred snout against Dean's chest. "You fed it," Caldwell rasped, his translated voice thick with disgust. "You offered sustenance to a biological weapon." "It was hungry," Dean said, looking away from the screen. "You keep them down in the dark, you starve them, and then you wonder why they want to tear your arms off every time you open the door. They aren't machines, Caldwell. They're just angry dogs. They are not dogs." Caldwell snapped, stepping forward, his exoskeleton clicking aggressively. "They are Class A siege breakers. You have contaminated their kill drive with your mammalian sentimentality." "Enough," Miller said softly. The word wasn't loud, but Caldwell instantly stepped back, his compound eyes lowering. Miller turned his attention back to Dean. "Currently, the 3 units in that pit are refusing to allow the automated feeders to attach. They have destroyed 2 maintenance drones. They are agitated, aggressive, and highly volatile." Miller paused, tilting his head. "Except when we broadcast your vocal audio through the PA system. Then they sit down and wait by the grated door." Dean frowned, processing the information. The dull throbbing in his shoulder suddenly felt very far away. He looked at the intelligence director. "What do you want, Miller?" "The coalition doesn't waste resources, Dean." "We recycle," Miller said, echoing Caldwell's earlier words, though the context had completely shifted. "You failed out of the standard infantry track. You are, by all metrics, a substandard soldier. You lack the agility for recon, the strength for heavy weapons, and the discipline for command." Miller put the data pad back into his pocket. "However," the director continued, "you have somehow bypassed the hyper-aggressive neural pathways of our most lethal siege weapons using a cracked rib and half a nutrient bar. The Vanguard program costs the Coalition 3 billion credits annually, and we can barely point them in the right direction without losing a platoon." Dean felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He suddenly wished he was back in the cold, damp pit. "I'm not a handler," Dean said, his voice tightening. "I don't know the first thing about alien biology." "You don't need to know their biology. You just need to hold the leash," Miller said. He gestured to the medical droid. "Get him dressed. Standard handler fatigues, class 4 body armor." "Wait, hold on." Dean swung his legs off the table, wincing as his shoulder pulled. "You're sending me back in there with them?" Miller turned toward the door, Caldwell falling into step behind him. The director paused at the threshold and looked back over his shoulder. His slate-gray eyes were devoid of warmth. "Not just in there, Handler Dean. We are currently engaged in a brutal urban pacification in Sector 4. High casualties. The enemy is entrenched in a subterranean network." Miller adjusted his cuffs. "You deploy in 3 hours. Get acquainted with your squad. I suggest you bring more peanut butter." The Class 4 handler armor didn't fit. It was designed for someone with a barrel chest and arms thick enough to wrestle a transport vehicle, not a washed-out infantry cadet running on 3 hours of sleep and synthetic adrenaline. It hung heavy on Dean's frame, pulling aggressively at his newly patched left shoulder. The rigid composite plating smelled intensely of industrial solvent and cold rubber, and every time he took a deep breath, the internal atmospheric seal hissed, a tiny, annoying reminder of his own fragility. He stood in the cavernous expanse of Staging Bay 7. Around him, the organized chaos of a coalition deployment was in full swing. Heavily armed platoons of mixed species rushed past, boots slamming against the steel deck, shouting over the deafening, cyclical whine of dropship engines warming up. The air was a thick soup of exhaust fumes, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Dean felt entirely invisible, right up until he approached the Vanguard containment zone. It was a cordoned-off section at the far end of the bay, flanked by reinforced barricades and manned by a dozen twitchy security personnel. As Dean walked toward them, the surrounding noise seemed to drop an octave. Regular infantry gave the area a wide berth, their eyes flicking nervously toward the heavy, blast-proof holding pen. A tech officer, a lanky human with a clipboard and a terrified expression, stepped up to Dean. He shoved a heavy, matte black control module into Dean's good hand. It was covered in toggle switches and a prominent red dial. "Pain compliance matrix," the tech shouted over the ambient engine roar. "Channel 1 is the alpha, 2 and 3 are the subordinates. Keep your thumb on the master override. If they turn on you, crank it to maximum and burn their nervous systems out before they can bite through your helmet." Dean looked down at the plastic brick. It felt dirty in his palm. He remembered the swollen, weeping joint on Duke's forelimb. He remembered the flinch. "Take it back," Dean said, shoving the module back against the tech's chest. The tech blinked, stumbling back a step. "Cadet, that's your primary control. I said take it back. I don't know how to use it, and I'm not going to learn today." Dean turned away before the tech could argue, walking directly toward the blast doors of the holding pen. He keyed the comms on his helmet. "Open it up." The security guards exchanged panicked looks. One of them tapped his earpiece, likely confirming the order with Director Miller, who was watching from an overhead gantry. A second later, the heavy hydraulic locks disengaged with a sound like a rifle shot. The steel doors slid apart. The stench hit Dean instantly, the same feral musk from the pit, concentrated in a tiny room, but now spiked with the acrid scent of extreme stress. The three hounds were pacing frantically. Scrap and Patch were throwing their armored bodies against the reinforced walls, their claws tearing long, ragged strips of metal from the paneling. In the center, Duke stood rigid, his head low, sensory pits flared wide and trembling with explosive tension. They were terrified. The noise, the vibrations of the ship, the cramped space, it was sensory overload, driving them into a frenzy. Dean stepped inside. The heavy doors hissed shut behind him, cutting off the deafening noise of the staging bay. Instantly, all three beasts snapped their attention to him. Their mandibles clicked in a chaotic crescendo. Scrap lunged forward, stopping just inches from Dean's chest, a low, rumbling hiss vibrating the deck plates. Dean didn't raise his hands. He didn't tense his muscles. He let out a long, heavy sigh, letting his shoulders slump under the excessive weight of the armor. Reaching up with his good hand, he unlatched his helmet and pulled it off, dropping it onto the floor with a dull clatter to expose his face to the foul air. "Yeah, I know," Dean said softly, his voice echoing in the small metal room. "It sucks. It's loud, it stinks, and nobody wants to be here." Duke pushed past the smaller hound. The massive alpha stepped into Dean's personal space. The eyeless, armored wedge of its head lowered, sensory pits rippling wildly as they mapped the contours of Dean's face, pulling in his scent beneath the industrial rubber of the armor. The beast let out a sharp huff, a burst of hot air that plastered Dean's sweat-soaked hair to his forehead. Dean reached into the heavy utility pouch strapped to his thigh. He pulled out a large, industrial-sized jar of synthetic peanut butter he had strong-armed from the mess hall quartermaster 20 minutes ago. He unscrewed the lid. The frenzied clicking stopped instantly. Duke's head snapped down to the jar, his massive jaws parting. Dean didn't flinch as a thick gray tongue slithered out, scooping a massive glob of the dense paste directly from the plastic container. Duke swallowed, letting out a deep, chest-rattling rumble that sounded dangerously close to a purr. "Easy, big guy," Dean murmured, letting Scrap and Patch crowd in to get their share. He rested his right hand heavily on the thick, scarred armor of Duke's neck, feeling the coarse hide beneath his fingers. "Just stick with me. We're going to take a really awful ride," and then we're going to go for a walk. The floor beneath them shuddered violently as the dropship detached from the bay. Dean sat down heavily on the deck, leaning his back against the cold steel wall. Duke circled once, claws scraping loudly, before collapsing beside him and resting his heavy head directly across Dean's armored thighs. Scrap and Patch settled against his sides, effectively burying the human in a mountain of vibrating muscle. Dean closed his eyes, listening to the muffled roar of the atmospheric thrusters engaging. He was plunging into an active war zone with zero combat training, guided by 3 feral alien predators. He tasted the peanut butter lingering in the humid air, and for the first time all day, he didn't feel completely alone. Sector 4 wasn't a battlefield, it was a grave being dug in real time. The dropship slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact that threw Dean hard against Duke's armored flank. Outside, the world was a cacophony of tearing metal and rolling thunder. The subterranean network of the sector was a massive, sprawling labyrinth of concrete transit tunnels, industrial refineries, and dark, claustrophobic shafts. The heavy boarding ramp dropped with a screech of tortured hydraulics. Dim, flickering emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows through dust-choked air. Concrete dust was everywhere, a fine, chalky powder that coated the back of the throat and tasted sharply of alkaline and dried blood. "Handler unit, move out," the dropship pilot screamed over the intercom, his voice cracking with static. "We are taking heavy fire. Clear the ramp." Dean grabbed his helmet, shoving it over his head. The internal HUD flickered to life, bathing his vision in a pale green overlay. He didn't have a weapon, they hadn't issued him one. You don't give the dog walker a rifle, you just tell him to unclip the leash. "Come on!" Dean yelled, slapping Duke's shoulder. The hounds didn't need to be told twice. The instant the ramp hit the ground, their predatory instincts overrode their fear of the transport. They surged forward, a terrifying blur of chitinous armor and rippling muscle. Dean scrambled after them, his boots slipping on the rubble-strewn concrete as he ran down the ramp into the gloom. The noise was absolute. Somewhere in the dark ahead, heavy plasma artillery was chewing through a reinforced bulkhead, sending physical shockwaves rolling down the corridor that rattled Dean's teeth in his skull. The air was baking hot, suffocatingly thick with the smell of vaporized plastiles and chemical fires. 50 yards down the primary transit artery, Dean found the remnants of the coalition infantry unit they were supposed to relieve. They were pinned down behind the shattered remains of a transport train. Searing bolts of purple plasma whipped over their heads, melting deep, glowing craters into the concrete walls behind them. The enemy, a local insurrectionist faction heavily entrenched in the maintenance tunnels, had set up overlapping fields of fire from 2 elevated pillboxes further down the tunnel. It was a meat grinder. Anyone stepping out from behind the train was instantly vaporized. A coalition sergeant, his armor scorched black and half his visor blown away, grabbed Dean by the shoulder plate and yanked him down into the dirt behind the train's rusted wheels. "Where the hell is your weapon, cadet?" the sergeant roared over the deafening crack of incoming fire. "Where's the handler remote?" Dean didn't answer. He was staring at the hounds. Duke, Scrap, and Patch hadn't taken cover. They stood in the center of the tunnel, bathed in the strobe light flashes of incoming plasma. Heavy bolts impacted against their thick biological armor, splashing off the chitin in harmless showers of sparks. They were built for this. They were siege breakers. But they weren't attacking. They were pacing, their sensory pits flaring, heads snapping toward the elevated pillboxes and then back to Dean. They were waiting for the agonizing jolt of the pain compliance collar to tell them who to kill. They were waiting to be hurried into action. Dean pushed himself up onto his knees, his left shoulder screaming in protest, but he ignored it. He locked eyes with the sensory pits on Duke's massive, scarred head. He didn't have a remote. He just had the memory of a tired dog at an Omaha gas station, and the heavy weight of a peanut butter jar in his thigh pouch. Dean pointed a single, trembling armored finger down the tunnel, directly at the left pillbox. "Duke! Dean screamed, his voice tearing his throat raw, stripping away military protocols and paralyzing fear. Get him. Duke didn't hesitate. The massive beast unleashed a roar that completely drowned out the artillery fire, a sound so deep and resonant it cracked the remaining glass in the transport train. Duke hit the ground, massive hind legs exploding with terrifying kinetic force. The Alpha cleared 30 feet in a single bound, launching itself off the curved wall and hurtling toward the left pillbox like a freight train made of razors. Scrap and Patch followed instantly, a synchronized wave of violence tearing down the right flank. The sergeant beside Dean stopped firing. He just stared, his mouth hanging open behind his shattered visor. There was no grace to it. It was brutal, terrifying physics. Duke slammed into the reinforced plastiles of the pillbox. The metal groaned and buckled under the sheer mass of the beast. Heavy, scythe-like forelimbs blurred, tearing through the barricade as if it were wet cardboard. The screams that followed were short, sharp, and abruptly silenced by the sickening crunch of mandibles meeting bone. On the right, Scrap and Patch were a coordinated nightmare, flushing the insurrectionists out of cover and running them down before they could even level their weapons. It wasn't a battle. It was pest control. Within 40 seconds, the deafening roar of incoming plasma stopped. The tunnel fell into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the wet tearing sounds echoing from the dark. Dean slumped back against the rusted wheel of the train, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His hands were shaking violently. A heavy thud vibrated through the ground, followed by a wet scraping sound. Dean opened his eyes. Duke was standing over him. The beast's mandibles were slick with dark fluid, its gray armor coated in a fine layer of concrete dust. The Alpha lowered its massive head, sensory pits twitching, and nudged Dean's armored chest with its scarred snout, a heavy, demanding push. Dean let out a weak, hysterical laugh. His hands trembled as he reached into his thigh pouch, pulling out the jar of peanut butter. Yeah, hold on, Dean wheezed, unscrewing the lid. Good boy. The coalition infantry emerged from behind the shattered transport train slowly, like men waking from a collective nightmare. They kept their shock rifles raised, their helmet visors scanning the dark recesses of the tunnel. Sergeant Briggs, the name stenciled in faded white paint across his blackened chest plate, stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly over the debris. He stopped 10 feet from Dean, his eyes locked on the massive, armored bulk of the Vanguard Hounds. Scrap and Patch were busy pacing the perimeter of the destroyed pillboxes, their mandibles clicking as they nosed through the rubble. Duke, however, was sitting squarely in front of Dean, diligently licking the last remnants of synthetic peanut butter from the plastic rim of the jar. You didn't use the module, Briggs stated, his voice a flat, disbelieving rasp filtered through his ruined helmet. He looked at Dean's empty hands, then down at where the heavy black control matrix was supposed to be. How did you trigger the kill command without the pain matrix? They're supposed to be hardlocked to the collar frequencies. Dean carefully screwed the lid back onto the empty jar and shoved it into his thigh pouch. His left shoulder was an agonizing, hot knot of tension, the medical droid's numbing gel had worn off entirely, leaving a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed with his heartbeat. I didn't trigger a command, Dean said tiredly, grabbing the edge of the train wheel with his good hand to pull himself up. I just pointed. They did the rest. Briggs took a slow step back as Duke shifted his weight. The Alpha Hound turned its eyeless, wedge-shaped head toward the sergeant, its sensory pits flaring wide to take in the scent of human sweat, fear, and ozone. A low, rattling vibration started in Duke's chest, a warning sound that resonated in the stagnant air. Hey, no! Dean snapped, stepping between the sergeant and the massive alien predator. He rested his right hand on the coarse, scarred hide of Duke's neck. Stand down. We're on the same side. Duke let out a sharp huff of air, blowing a cloud of concrete dust off Briggs's boots, but the deep rumbling stopped. The beast nudged Dean's hip, effectively pushing the human slightly backward and placing its armored bulk marginally closer to the heavily armed infantryman, a subtle, protective gesture that made Dean's chest tighten. "Command wants us pushing to the central refinery manifold," Briggs said, his eyes never leaving Duke's mandibles. He tapped the side of his helmet. "Intel says the insurrectionists have fortified the primary water reclamation pumps. If they detonate the charges there, this whole subterranean sector floods. We drown in the dark." Dean looked down the tunnel. Beyond the destroyed pillboxes, the transit artery descended at a steep angle, plunging into a pitch-black expanse where the emergency lighting had entirely failed. The air down there was colder, smelling of damp rot, rust, and stagnant water. "All right," Dean muttered. He picked up a discarded shock rifle from the dirt, checking the charge indicator. It was heavy and awkward in his one good hand, but he didn't want to walk into the dark completely unarmed. "Let's go for a walk." The descent was miserable. The tunnel floor was slick with a layer of industrial sludge and standing water that splashed sluggishly around their ankles. Dean walked point, directly behind the three hounds. The beasts moved differently in the dark. Without the frenzied constraints of the holding pen or the chaotic noise of the staging bay, they were eerily silent. Their heavy claws retracted slightly so only the soft padded thud of their massive paws echoed off the walls. "Movement," Briggs hissed from behind his rifle visor, snapping to a halt. 50 yards ahead, the tunnel widened into a massive, cavernous junction. Thick iron pipes crusted with decades of mineral buildup crisscrossed the ceiling. Duke stopped dead. The Alpha dropped low to the ground, the armored plating along its spine flaring upward. Scrap and Patch instantly mirrored the movement, their bodies pressing flat against the wet, sludgy floor. From the shadows of the junction, a harsh mechanical whine began to spool up, not plasma fire, but the sound of a massive industrial turbine spinning beyond its redline. A blinding, searing yellow floodlight suddenly ignited, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet walls. "Heavy armor," someone in the squad screamed. A repurposed mining crawler stepped into the junction. It was a towering, quadrupedal monstrosity of riveted yellow steel, heavily modified with thick, sloped armor plating and twin rotary plasma cannons mounted on its central chassis. It was designed to bore through solid bedrock, it didn't care about biological weapons. The rotary cannons spun to a blur, and the tunnel erupted into white-hot hell. The noise was a physical blow that knocked Dean off his feet. He hit the sludgy ground hard, tasting stagnant water and old oil as a solid stream of blinding yellow plasma tore through the space he had just occupied. "Get back!" Briggs roared over the deafening roar of the cannons. The infantry scrambled backward, firing uselessly at the crawler. Their blue plasma bolts splashed against the sloped yellow armor without leaving a dent. Dean looked up through the blinding smoke. The hounds hadn't retreated. Duke, Scrap, and Patch were violently zigzagging through the incoming fire, using their terrifying acceleration to close the distance. But the tunnel offered no cover. A stray bolt caught Patch in the hindquarters. The smaller hound let out a piercing, metallic shriek that sounded like tearing sheet metal, tumbling end over end into the shallow water. "No!" Dean's heart seized. Scrap reached the crawler first, launching violently into the air, but the sloped armor offered no purchase. The crawler's massive mechanical legs shifted, swatting Scrap out of the air with a sickening, heavy thud. The hound crashed into the tunnel wall and didn't immediately get back up. Duke was directly underneath the machine now, tearing frantically at the heavy hydraulic lines protecting the crawler's underbelly, but the thick steel mesh held. The crawler's main turret began to pivot downward, the glowing barrels taking aim directly at the Alpha's exposed back. The machine was going to cut him in half. The cynical, survival-driven part of Dean's brain screamed at him to stay in the mud. He was a washed-out cadet with a busted shoulder and thin armor. But his legs were already moving. He grabbed the heavy shock rifle from the muck, abandoned the useless sling, and sprinted forward, out of the darkness and directly into the blinding yellow glare of the crawler's floodlights. "Hey!" Dean screamed, his voice raw. He didn't aim at the heavy armor plating. He aimed at the top of the crawler, where a cluster of glass-encased optical sensors glowed an angry red. He braced the heavy rifle against a structural pipe, squeezed his eyes shut against the recoil, and held the trigger down. The rifle kicked violently, tearing at his ruined left shoulder, but the blue plasma bolts sailed true. They smashed straight into the optical cluster, shattering the heavy glass and melting the delicate internal lenses. The crawler let out a harsh, digitized squeal. Blinded, its targeting matrix threw a chaotic error, and the massive main turret abruptly stopped its downward pivot, snapping upward to randomly rake the ceiling. Heavy iron pipes burst open, raining a torrent of scalding, rusty water down onto the metal chassis. Duke didn't waste the opening. With a deafening, bone-rattling roar, the Alpha Hound surged upward, hauling his massive 1,000-pound bulk onto the side of the crawler. His thick, side-like forelimbs plunged deep into the ruined optical cluster Dean had just blown open, tearing past melted glass and ripping straight into the machine's primary data conduit. Sparks showered like a violent firework display. Duke bit down hard into the exposed wiring, shaking his massive wedge-shaped head violently until the crawler shuddered, its mechanical legs spasming outward with a final, dying whine. The machine collapsed into the sludge, completely dead. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of rushing water from the ruptured overhead pipes and the heavy, ragged breathing of the hounds. Dean dropped the spent shock rifle. He slid down the curved side of the iron pipe until he was sitting in the cold sludge, his left arm completely numb and his chest heaving. Through the haze of steam and smoke, a massive shadow approached. Duke moved slowly, limping slightly on his left foreleg. The beast's armored face was scorched black, its sensory pits raw from the intense heat. He didn't ask for a treat, nor did he nudge Dean's chest. The Alpha simply lowered his heavy bulk down into the freezing water right next to Dean, pressing his heat-radiating flank against the human's trembling shoulder. A moment later, Scrap and Patch limped over, battered and bleeding clear fluid from shallow scorch marks, but alive. They curled up on Dean's right side, clicking softly in the gloom. Sergeant Briggs and the rest of the squad walked up slowly, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They stared at the destroyed multi-ton mining crawler, and then at the exhausted cadets sitting in the mud, completely buried under 3 of the galaxy's most lethal biological weapons. "Cadet," Briggs said softly, the previous skepticism in his voice replaced entirely by a quiet, profound respect. "Is your squad ready to move?" Dean let his head fall back against the cold iron pipe. He rested his right hand on Duke's heavily scarred neck, feeling the slow, steady thump of the beast's massive heart. "Give us a minute, Sergeant," Dean rasped, closing his eyes. "The dogs are tired." The final walk to the primary water reclamation pumps took another 20 agonizing minutes. Guided by Duke's heightened sensory pits, the squad located the insurrectionists' rigged thermobaric charge hidden near the main pressure valve, bypassing a secondary chemical tripwire beneath the floor grating that would have wiped out the entire cavern. By the time the extraction dropship broke the atmospheric cloud cover, the harsh light of the system's pale sun was bleeding through the troop bay windows. When the ramp lowered at staging bay 7, Director Miller was waiting on the tarmac. His pristine dark suit was a jarring contrast to the mud-soaked reality of the returning squad. 4 heavily armed guards flanked him. Miller looked down at his data pad, then up at Dean. "A highly unconventional success, Handler Dean. You lost control of the assets, but they managed to secure the objective." "I didn't lose control, Miller," Dean said, stroking his thumb over the rough hide between Duke's closed sensory pits as the Alpha rested its heavy head across his lap. "I never had it. You don't control them." "Be that as it may," Miller gestured to the guards. "The operation is concluded. Secure the assets and return them to the holding pens." The guards stepped forward, raising heavy stun prods. Duke awoke instantly. The Alpha snapped his head up, mandibles parting in a silent, terrifying display of curved teeth. A low rumbling vibration started deep in his chest, making the guards freeze in their tracks. Scrap and Patch rose beside him, bodies coiled and ready to spring. "Stand down," Miller ordered his guards, his voice wavering slightly. He glared at Dean. "Control your beasts, Cadet." "They aren't beasts," Dean said quietly. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily against Duke's armored shoulder. The alien supported the human's weight without hesitation. "And they aren't going back in the dark. If you try to drag them, they'll tear you apart." Miller stared, weighing the astronomical cost of 3 billion credits of biological weaponry against the broken, stubborn human standing before him. "You are a very insubordinate soldier, Dean." "I'm a washout," Dean corrected, a tired smile cracking his grime-covered face. "I'm just a guy walking his dogs." Miller turned on his heel and walked away without another word, his guards hastily following behind. Dean stood on the open ramp, the cold wind washing over him. He reached into his thigh pouch, his fingers brushing the empty plastic jar. He'd have to raid the mess hall quartermaster again soon. The dogs were going to be hungry.